Shalom. I want to give all praises and glory to Yahweh by Hashem Yahushua. Double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone. Much love and salutation to you, Akim, out there teaching this word in the truth and sincerity in the name of Yahweh by Hashem Yahushua. And right here, I just want to basically play this audio book of the Confessions of Nat Turner when he was captured on the 1st of November, 1831. It was the Edomite that had came and interviewed him in the jail. And he was later executed, I believe, on the 11th, but it's all spiritual. But this right here is an audio, not the original audio, but it's like a book that was read, you know. But this devil has an aggravating voice. I would read it, but it's gonna be 30 minutes long. So just put on your headphones, whatever you do. I mean, just make sure that you listen to it during your spare time. But it's the actual words of Nat Turner. His Edomite voice might be aggravating, man. He sound like a sodomite or something like that. Just sound weird and wicked, man. But just bear with it, and try to get like into the frame of mind and just envision off. But it's a 49 minutes long, and right here I'm at the 15-minute mark. I had to skip over a lot of stuff, so just bear with me. All right, bro. Shalom.
And said, as the Savior had been baptized, so should we be also. And when the white people would not let us be baptized by the church, we went down into the water together in the sight of many who reviled us, and were baptized by the Spirit. After this I rejoiced greatly, and gave thanks to God. And on the 12th of May, 1828, I heard a loud noise in the heavens, and the Spirit instantly appeared to me, and said the serpent was loosened, and Christ had laid down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, and that I should take it on and fight against the serpent, for the time was fast approaching when the first should be last, and the last should be first. Question: do you not find yourself mistaken now? Was not Christ crucified? And by signs in the heavens that it would make known to me when I should commence the great work, and until the first sign appeared, I should conceal it from the knowledge of men. And on the appearance of the sign, the eclipse of the sun last February, I should arise and prepare myself, and slay my enemies with their own weapons. And immediately on the sign appearing in the heavens, the seal was removed from my lips, and I communicated the great work laid out for me to do to four in whom I had the greatest confidence: Henry, Hark, Nelson, and Sam. It was intended by us to have begun the work of death on the 4th July last. Many were the plans formed and rejected by us, and it affected my mind to such a degree that I fell sick, and the time passed without our coming to any determination how to commence. Still forming new schemes and rejecting them, when the sign appeared again, which determined me not to wait longer. Since the commencement of 1830, I had been living with Mr. Joseph Travis, who was to me a kind master, and placed the greatest confidence in me. In fact, I had no cause to complain of his treatment to me. On Saturday evening, the 20th of August, it was agreed between Henry, Hark, and myself to prepare a dinner the next day for the men we expected, and then to concert a plan, as we had not yet determined on any. Hark, on the following morning, brought a pig, and Henry brandy, and being joined by Sam, Nelson, Will, and Jack, They prepared in the woods a dinner where, about 3 o'clock, I joined them. Question. Why were you so backward in joining them? The same reason that had caused me not to mix with them for years before. I saluted them on coming up and asked Will how came he there. He answered, his life was worth no more than others, and his liberty as dear to him. I asked him if he thought to obtain it. He said he would, or lose his life. This was enough to put him in full confidence. Jack, I knew, was only a tool in the hands of Hark. It was quickly agreed we should commence at home on that night, and until we had armed and equipped ourselves and gathered sufficient force, neither age nor sex was to be spared, which was invariably adhered to. We remained at the feast until about 2 hours in the night, when we went to the house and found Austin. They all went to the cider press and drank, except myself. On returning to the house, Hark went to the door with an axe for the purpose of breaking it open, as we knew we were strong enough to murder the family if they were awaked by the noise. But reflecting that it might create an alarm in the neighborhood, we determined to enter the house secretly and murder them whilst sleeping. Hark got a ladder and set it against the chimney, on which I ascended, and hoisting a window, entered and came downstairs, unbarred the door, and removed the guns from their places. It was then observed that I must spill the first blood, on which, armed with a hatchet and accompanied by Will, I entered my master's chamber. It being dark, I could not give a death blow. The hatchet glanced from his head. He sprang from the bed and called his wife. It was his last word. Will laid him dead with a blow of his axe, and Mrs. Travis shared the same fate as she lay in bed. The murder of this family, 5 in number, was the work of a moment. Not one of them awoke. There was a little infant sleeping in a cradle that was forgotten until we had left the house and gone some distance, when Henry and Will returned and killed it. We got here 4 guns that would shoot, and several old muskets, with a pound or 2 of powder. We remained some time at the barn, where we paraded. I formed them in a line as soldiers, and after carrying them through all the maneuvers I was master of, marched them off to Mr. Salafol Francis's, about 600 yards distant. Sam and Will went to the door and knocked. Mr. Francis asked who was there. Sam replied it was him, and he had a letter for him, on which he got up and came to the door. They immediately seized him and dragged him out a little from the door. He was dispatched by repeated blows on the head. There was no other white person in the family. We started from there for Mrs. Reese's, maintaining the most perfect silence on our march, where, finding the door unlocked, we entered and murdered Mrs. Reese in her bed while sleeping. Her son awoke, but it was only to sleep the sleep of death. He had only time to say, "Who is that?" and he was no more. From Mrs. Reese's we went to Mrs. Turner's, a mile distant, which we reached about sunrise on Monday morning. Henry, Austin, and Sam went to the still, where, finding Mr. Pebbles, Austin shot him, and the rest of us went to the house. As we approached, the family discovered us and shut the door. Vain hope! Will, with one stroke of his axe, opened it, and we entered and found Mrs. Turner and Mrs. Newsome in the middle of a room, almost frightened to death. Will immediately killed Mrs. Turner with one blow of his axe. I took Mrs. Newsome by the hand, and with the sword I had when I was apprehended, I struck her several blows over the head, but not being able to kill her, as the sword was dull. Will, turning around and discovering it, dispatched her also. A general destruction of property and search for money and ammunition always succeeded the murders. By this time, my company amounted to 15, and 9 men mounted, who started for Mrs. Whitehead's. The other 6 were to go through a byway to Mr. Bryant's and rejoin us at Mrs. Whitehead's. As we approached the house, we discovered Mr. Richard Whitehead standing in the cotton patch near the lane fence. We called him over into the lane, and Will, the executioner, was near at hand with his fatal axe to send him to an untimely grave. As we pushed on to the house, I discovered someone run round the garden, and thinking it was some of the White family, I pursued them. But finding it was a servant girl belonging to the house, I returned to commence the work of death, but they whom I left had not been idle. All the family were already murdered, but Mrs. Whitehead and her daughter Margaret. As I came round to the door, I saw Will pulling Mrs. Whitehead out of the house, and at the step he nearly severed her head from her body with his broad axe. Miss Margaret, when I discovered her, had concealed herself in the corner, formed by the projection of the cellar cap from the house. On my approach she fled, but was soon overtaken, and after repeated blows with a sword, I killed her by a blow on the head with a fence rail. By this time, the 6 who had gone to Mr. Bryant's rejoined us, and informed me they had done the work of death assigned them. We again divided, part going to Mr. Richard Porter's, and from thence to Nathaniel Francis, the others to Mr. Howell Harris and Mr. T. Doyle's. On my reaching Mr. Porter's, he had escaped with his family. I understood there that the alarm had already spread, and I immediately returned to bring up those sent to Mr. Doyle's and Mr. Howell Harris's. The party I left going on to Mr. Francis's, having told them I would join them in that neighborhood. I met these sent to Mr. Doyle's and Mr. Harris's returning, having met Mr. Doyle on the road and killed him, and learning from some who joined them that Mr. Harris was from home, I immediately pursued the course taken by the party gone on before. But knowing that they would complete the work of death and pillage at Mr. Francis before I could get there, I went to Mr. Peter Edwards, expecting to find them there, but they had been here also. I then went to Mr. John T. Barrows. They had been here and murdered him. I pursued on their track to Captain Newitt Harris's, where I found the greater part mounted and ready to start. The men, now amounting to about 40, shouted and hurrahed as I rode up. Some were in the yard loading their guns, others drinking. They said Captain Harris and his family had escaped. The property in the house they destroyed, robbing him of money and other valuables. I ordered them to mount and march instantly. This was about 9 or 10 o'clock Monday morning. I proceeded to Mr. Levi Waller's, 2 or 3 miles distant. I took my station in the rear, and as it was my object to carry terror and devastation wherever we went, I placed 15 or 20 of the best armed and most to be relied on in front, who generally approached the houses as fast as their horses could run. This was for two purposes: to prevent their escape and strike terror to the inhabitants. On this account, I never got to the houses, after leaving Mrs. Whitehead's, until the murders were committed, except in one case. I sometimes got in sight in time to see the work of death completed, viewed the mangled bodies as they lay, in silent satisfaction, and immediately started in quest of other victims. Having murdered Mrs. Waller and 10 children, we started for Mr. William Williams, having killed him and 2 little boys that were there. While engaged in this, Mrs. Williams fled and got some distance from the house, but she was pursued, overtaken, and compelled to get up behind one of the company, who brought her back, and after showing her the mangled body of her lifeless husband, she was told to get down and lay by his side, where she was shot dead. I then started for Mr. Jacob Williams, where the family were murdered. Here we found a young man named Drury, who had come on business with Mr. Williams. He was pursued, overtaken, and shot. Mrs. Vaughn was the next place we visited, and after murdering the family here, I determined on starting for Jerusalem. Our number amounted now to 50 or 60, all mounted and armed with guns, axes, swords, and clubs. On reaching Mr. James W. Parker's gate, immediately on the road leading to Jerusalem and about 3 miles distant, it was proposed to me to call there, but I objected, as I knew he was gone to Jerusalem, and my object was to reach there as soon as possible. But some of the men having relations at Mr. Parker's, it was agreed that they might call and get his people. I remained at the gate on the road, with 7 or 8, the others going across the field to the house, about half a mile off. After waiting some time for them, I became impatient and started to the house for them, and on our return we were met by a party of white men, who had pursued our blood-stained track, and who had fired on those at the gate and dispersed them, which I knew nothing of, not having been at that time rejoined by any of them. Immediately on discovering the whites, I ordered my men to halt and form, as they appeared to be alarmed. The white men, 18 in number, approached us in about 100 yards, when one of them fired. Recorder's note. This was against the positive orders of Captain Alexander P. Peet, who commanded, and who had directed the men to reserve their fire until within 30 paces. And I discovered about half of them retreating. I then ordered my men to fire and rush on them. The few remaining stood their ground until we approached within 50 yards, when they fired and retreated. We pursued and overtook some of them who we thought we left dead. They were not killed. After pursuing them about 200 yards and rising a little hill, I discovered they were met by another party and had halted and were reloading their guns. Recorder's note. This was a small party from Jerusalem who knew the Negroes were in the field, and had just tied their horses to await their return to the road, knowing that Mr. Parker and family were in Jerusalem, but knew nothing of the party that had gone in with Captain Peet. On hearing the firing, they immediately rushed to the spot and arrived just in time to arrest the progress of these barbarous villains and save the lives of their friends and fellow citizens. Thinking that those who retreated first and the party who fired on us at 50 or 60 yards distant had all only fallen back to meet others with ammunition, as I saw them reloading their guns and more coming up than I saw at first, and several of my bravest men being wounded, the others became panic-struck and squandered over the field. The white men pursued and fired on us several times. Hark had his horse shot under him, and I caught another for him as it was running by me. 5 or 6 of my men were wounded, but none left on the field. Finding myself defeated here, I instantly determined to go through a private way and cross the Nottoway River at the Cypress Bridge, 3 miles below Jerusalem, and attack that place in the rear, as I expected they would look for me on the other road, and I had a great desire to get there to procure arms and ammunition. After going a short distance in this private way, accompanied by about 20 men, I overtook 2 or 3 who told me the others were dispersed in every direction. After trying in vain to collect a sufficient force to proceed to Jerusalem, I determined to return, as I was sure they would make back to their old neighborhood, where they would rejoin me, make new recruits, and come down again. On my way back, I called at Mrs. Thomas's, Mrs. Spencer's, and several other places. The white families having fled, we found no more victims to gratify our thirst for blood. We stopped at Major Ridley's quarter for the night, and being joined by 4 of his men, with the recruits made since my defeat, we mustered now about 40 strong. After placing out sentinels, I laid down to sleep, but was quickly roused by a great racket. Starting up, I found some mounted and others in great confusion. One of the sentinels having given the alarm that we were about to be attacked, I ordered some to ride round and reconnoiter, and on their return, the others being more alarmed, not knowing who they were, fled in different ways, so that I was reduced to about 20 again. With this, I determined to attempt to recruit and proceed on to rally in the neighborhood I had left. Dr. Blunt's was the nearest house, which we reached just before day. On riding up the yard, Hark fired a gun. We expected Dr. Blunt and his family were at Major Ridley's, as I knew there was a company of men there. The gun was fired to ascertain if any of the family were at home. We were immediately fired upon and retreated, leaving several of my men. I do not know what became of them, as I never saw them afterwards. Pursuing our course back and coming in sight of Captain Harris's, where we had been the day before, we discovered a party of white men at the house, on which all deserted me but 2, Jacob and Nat. We concealed ourselves in the woods until near night, when I sent them in search of Henry, Sam, Nelson, and Hark, and directed them to rally all they could at the place we had had our dinner the Sunday before, where they would find me, and I accordingly returned there as soon as it was dark and remained until Wednesday evening, when discovering white men riding around the place as though they were looking for someone, and none of my men joining me, I concluded Jacob and Nat had been taken and compelled to betray me. On this I gave up all hope for the present, and on Thursday night, after having supplied myself with provisions from Mr. Travis's, I scratched a hole under a pile of fence rails in a field, where I concealed myself for 6 weeks, never leaving my hiding place but for a few minutes in the dead of night to get water which was very near. Thinking by this time I could venture out, I began to go about in the night and eavesdrop the houses in the neighborhood. Pursuing this course for about a fortnight and gathering little or no intelligence, afraid of speaking to any human being, and returning every morning to my cave before the dawn of day. I know not how long I might have led this life, if accident had not betrayed me. A dog in the neighborhood passing by my hiding place one night while I was out was attracted by some meat I had in my cave and crawled in and stole it, and was coming out just as I returned. A few nights after, two Negroes having started to go hunting with the same dog and passed that way, the dog came again to the place, and having just gone out to walk about, discovered me and barked, on which, thinking myself discovered, I spoke to them to beg concealment. On making myself known, they fled from me. Knowing then they would betray me, I immediately left my hiding place and was pursued almost incessantly until I was taken a fortnight afterwards by Mr. Benjamin Phipps in a little hole I had dug out with my sword for the purpose of concealment under the top of a fallen tree. On Mr. Phipps discovering the place of my concealment, he cocked his gun and aimed at me. I requested him not to shoot, and I would give up, upon which he demanded my sword. I delivered it to him, and he brought me to prison. During the time I was pursued, I had many hairbreadth escapes, which your time will not permit you to relate. I am here, loaded with chains, and willing to suffer the fate that awaits me. I here proceeded to make some inquiries of him. After assuring him of the certain death that awaited him, and that concealment would only bring destruction on the innocent as well as guilty of his own color, if he knew of any extensive or concerted plan. His answer was, I do not. When I questioned him as to the insurrection in North Carolina happening about the same time, he denied any knowledge of it. And when I looked him in the face as though I would search his inmost thoughts, he replied, I see, sir, you doubt my word. But can you not think the same ideas? The strange appearances about this time in the heavens might prompt others, as well as myself, to this undertaking? I now had much conversation with and asked him many questions, having forborne to do so previously, except in the cases noted in parentheses. But during his statement I had, unnoticed by him, taken notes as to some particular circumstances, and having the advantage of his statement before me in writing, on the evening of the third day that I had been with him, I began a cross-examination, and found his statement corroborated by every circumstance coming within my own knowledge, or the confessions of others whom had been either killed or executed, and whom he had not seen nor had any knowledge since 22nd of August last. He expressed himself fully satisfied as to the impracticability of his attempt. It has been said he was ignorant and cowardly, and that his object was to murder and rob for the purpose of obtaining money to make his escape. It is notorious that he was never known to have $1 in his life, to swear an oath, or drink a drop of spirits. As to his ignorance, he certainly never had the advantages of education, but he can read and write. It was taught him by his parents. And for natural intelligence and quickness of apprehension, is surpassed by few men I have ever seen. As to his being a coward, his reason as given for not resisting Mr. Phipps shows the decision of his character. When he saw Mr. Phipps present his gun, he said he knew it was impossible for him to escape, as the woods were full of men. He therefore thought it was better to surrender and trust to fortune for his escape. He is a complete fanatic, or plays his part most admirably. On other subjects, he possesses an uncommon share of intelligence, with a mind capable of attaining anything, but warped and perverted by the influence of early impressions. He is below the ordinary stature, though strong and active, having the true Negro face, every feature of which is strongly marked. I shall not attempt to describe the effect of his narrative, as told and commented on by himself in the condemned hole of the prison. The calm, deliberate composure with which he spoke of his late deeds and intentions, the expression of his fiend-like face when excited by enthusiasm, still bearing the stains of the blood of helpless innocence about him, clothed with rags and covered with chains, yet daring to raise his manacled hands to heaven with a spirit soaring above the attributes of man. I looked on him, and my blood curdled in my veins. I will not shock the feelings of humanity, nor wound afresh the bosoms of the disconsolate sufferers in this unparalleled and inhuman massacre, by detailing the deeds of their fiend-like barbarity. There were 2 or 3 who were in the power of these wretches, had they known it, and who escaped in the most providential manner. There were 2 whom they thought they left dead on the field at Mr. Parker's, but who were only stunned by the blows of their guns, as they did not take time to reload when they charged on them. The escape of a little girl who went to school at Mr. Waller's, and where the children were collecting for that purpose, excited general sympathy. As their teacher had not arrived, they were at play in the yard, and seeing the negroes approach, she ran up on a dirt chimney, such as are common to log houses, and remained there unnoticed during the massacre of the 11 that were killed at this place. She remained on her hiding place till just before the arrival of a party who were in pursuit of the murderers, when she came down and fled to a swamp, where, a mere child as she was, with the horrors of the late scene before her, she lay concealed until the next day, when seeing a party go up to the house, she came up, and on being asked how she escaped, replied with the utmost simplicity, "The Lord helped her." She was taken up behind a gentleman of the party, and returned to the arms of her weeping mother. Miss Whitehead concealed herself between the bed and the mat that supported it, while they murdered her sister in the same room without discovering her. She was afterwards carried off, and concealed for protection by a slave of the family, who gave evidence against several of them on their trial. Mrs. Nathaniel Francis, while concealed in a closet, heard their blows, and the shrieks of the victims of these ruthless savages. They then entered the closet where she was concealed and went out without discovering her. While in this hiding place, she heard two of her women in a quarrel about the division of her clothes. Mr. John T. Barron, discovering them approaching his house, told his wife to make her escape, and scorning to fly, fell fighting on his own threshold. After firing his rifle, he discharged his gun at them, and then broke it over the villain who first approached him. But he was overpowered and slain. His bravery, however, saved from the hands of these monsters his lovely and amiable wife, who will long lament a husband so deserving of her love. As directed by him, she attempted to escape through the garden when she was caught and held by one of her servant girls. But another coming to her rescue, she fled to the woods and concealed herself. Few indeed were those who escaped their work of death, but fortunate for society, the hand of retributive justice has overtaken them, and not one that was known to be concerned has escaped. That was The Confessions of Nat Turner, recorded by Thomas R. Gray on November 1st, 1831. Read by Frank Blissett.